I am led to Venice once again. Egregio signor von
I'm David Neese, and I'm delighted to be asked to be here this evening. I mean, it is a very historic occasion. I wanted to start by, first of all, asking if there is anybody in this audience who was actually there for the premiere or around of Death in Venice. You were. Wonderful. So this is already a dialogue that we can open up. And we will be having questions later, so we'd like to, we can bring you in at any point, but thank you for that. I hope there will be someone. I always live in hope that I will come across an opera performance at its premiere or at the British premiere, very close to the time of inception. And for me, really being an opera goer from the 80s, late 70s onwards, it's only happened 3 times. First with Nixon in China, up in Edinburgh in the late 1980s. Secondly with James Macmillan's The Sacrifice. And thirdly with Gerald Barry's The Importance of Being Earnest, a great comic opera. But I do so wish I had been old enough to be present at any of the Great Britain premieres. And this is why we're so very, very honoured to have Steuart Bedford with us tonight, who conducted not just the first performances at Aldborough, but also the recording. I'd hope we could stick it on a stand. This is my treasured copy. It has a very lovely Piper, John Piper design on the front, and it's beautifully illustrated. This is one of the reasons why one laments the decline of vinyl in the classical world. It's come back in the pop world. But I mean, the size and the beauty of the covers is something to exclaim at. Now, Steuart's going to take us through many of the themes of the opera with Andrew Wicks, who is covering. You're now Wicks rather than Mackenzie-Wicks, or both. I've known Andrew since the 90s when he was a mere chorine, and now he is covering one of the big roles, tenor roles in opera. So there will be a demonstration of many of the themes in the opera, and I think you're going to take us through Aschenbach's monologues. Is that right, Steuart?
Well, not all of them.
Not all of them, but I mean the gist thereof. It's half the opera, basically, isn't it?
Yes.
At least. And before that, I thought I would just like to start with asking Steuart very briefly whether you can tell us anything pertinent about how Britain was at the time of the premiere of Death in Venice. He had had his first heart attack, is that right? Just before the first performances.
Well, not quite.
Right.
We were rehearsing, what was it, in May at the Royal Opera House. And Peter Pearce, who was singing, we were doing Wingrave, which was the piece that came immediately before Death in Venice. And we were in the Opera House, and Peter came in and said, "Ben's on the table." And so there it was. That was in the middle of May. We then started to rehearse roughly at the same time for the original Death in Venice performances. And we had 5 weeks to do it in. Somehow we did, and it was actually a very comfortable and very happy period with everybody. Everybody was enthusiastic and involved, and Britain was nowhere near. He never came to a single rehearsal. Right. He was either convalescing from his operation, which had taken place back in May. In fact, when the festival opened in June, whatever it was, with the world premiere of Death in Venice, he left town and hid himself in his country little cottage out at Horham, which is in the north of Suffolk, about 20 miles outside Aldborough to the north. And the second performance was broadcast. And so he thought he couldn't resist talking it on, turning on the radio for a time just to see how it was going. And he got disturbed by some terrible noise and turned it off immediately. And so he never actually heard it at that time. What he actually heard was one of the revolving pillars. I don't have a picture of it on there, do we?
Where? In the booklet?
On the very front. Yeah, that is a revolving pillar. It's called a periactoid. Right. And it turns and has lovely John Pipers on the sides, on the 4 sides.
Right.
Actually, that doesn't look like Death in Venice at all, is it?
It is, yes. Canals. St Mark's canals, yes.
It's certainly John Piper.
Yes.
It's a long time ago.
There's more pictures inside.
So he never heard it until I played it to him much later on. And so he wasn't there, but we did have a marvellous time. I just had one bedside conference with him when we found we needed to cut one journey to and from Venice to the Lido. There's a lot of those in this piece.
You cut it because...
Well, it was just one too many,
right.
We felt at that time.
It wasn't a scene change, probably.
No.
Because normally with scene changes you add rather than detract.
Indeed,
yes.
Indeed.
Right. Maybe I should say just a little bit about the circumstances of the piece and indeed this incredible fertile correspondence with the Thomas Mann novella on which the work is based. The first thing probably to say is that it was as close to Britain's heart as any of his operas, possibly the closest, in that there are two preoccupations for both Mann and Britain. And I would say probably the homoerotic element is not less important, but is inextricably linked with this central theme, which for Mann was the theme between order and lucidity, the Apollonian side of the human spirit, the ordered writer that is Gustav von Aschenbach in his mid-50s, finding that he's come to a sterile point in his creativity, on the brink of wanting to explore the dark, irrational side. In fact, he doesn't so much want to explore it as it comes to him. And the dark side, one could say, is the Dionysian element. Even the cholera that comes to Venice and eventually kills Aschenbach could be seen as another of these visitors from the East. And in fact, these wonderful bass baritone roles that you have that were created by John Shirley Quirk, different characters, all representing the same facets of this dark spirit leading towards death, if not destruction. The story was actually based on an experience that Mann had had. He was wanting to write a story perhaps about Goethe in his 70s and his infatuation with a 17-year-old girl. And again, he wondered how this could happen to a man who was so detached and poised at that stage in his life. And he said several times that the sexuality was almost immaterial, except, of course, that it related to his own sexuality. He, by that stage, was already married, and he'd been to Venice in the spring of 1911, and there he had become infatuated with a young Polish boy, actually 10 and a half at the time. So you can see this is a big difference, which also plays into the question marks about Britain's own conflicts, that the boy in the novella is aged 14. And of course in the opera, it's usually played, I don't know whether this is going to be true at Garsington or not, by a dancer. And dancers being rather more developed than prepubescent boys, that again sort of knocks the age up a little more. Suffice it to say that there is this conflict of the ideal of beauty, the Apollonian ideal, which then gets confused and mixed up with the dark sexual urgings that basically, along with the cholera, help to destroy Aschenbach. It's a novel that works on two different levels. The realistic level, indeed, Mann himself went to Venice, he saw this boy and actually wrote a little essay on Wagner, who of course also died in Venice, on the beach, a 1.5-page essay whilst he was looking out and watching the young Tadzio, as the opera calls it. And in fact he gives Aschenbach this piece of writing, but of course it isn't about Wagner. So there are lots of composer links. It seems almost unconnected that he heard news of Gustav Mahler's death in 1911, just before he went to Italy. And I think the only connection there is that he gave Aschenbach the Christian name, Gustav, and the physiognomy of Mahler. There the correspondences stop. But this, of course, was a projection slightly forwards. Aschenbach was much older than Mann was at the time. He was only 36 when he wrote the novella. Britain, when he came to his last opera, was in his late 50s. But I think one of the fascinations that Steuart and Andrew will take us through is how this very poised, slightly distanced narrative, there is no first-person narrative from Aschenbach. It's all through the eyes of an omniscient narrator who slightly keeps his distance. How this transfers into the world of opera, first of all, of course, through Myfanwy Piper's consummate libretto, which means giving Aschenbach a series of monologues which are in the third person in the novella. And then, of course, how the dimension of music adds to this other dimension in the novella, which is the numinous, I suppose the philosophers would say, the world beyond the phenomenal world, which means that Aschenbach's death is both practically rather bluntly stated in the last sentence of the novella, a respectful word learnt of his death, and of course spiritual in the sense that the boy Tadzio beckoning is like Hermes or Mercury, the messenger, the psychopomp, as he would be called. And of course the opera has the most extraordinarily transcendent conclusion, which only music can truly provide. So I'd like to hand over to Steuart and Andrew just to take us through some of the themes.
One of the interesting things in the construction of this opera is this baritone role. Aschenbach offers the principal tenor, sings the whole opera. He's on stage practically the whole time. It's an enormous role. But the secondary role is a baritone, but he sings 7 different parts, all, as David has pointed out, conspire to drag him down, Aschenbach down, down the road that he doesn't really want to go. So all these characters have a specific motive. I'm going to go just through the motives of the opera. If you were in a Wagner opera, you would have in your score a table, a motive table on the score. And I counted up the number of motives there were in Siegfried, just to see how many there were. And there were over 80. That seems rather a lot. We've only got about 10 to deal with here, and they go quite quickly. Well, a little bit. And so we've got the first character is the strange traveller which Aschenbach meets on his walking around the suburbs of Munich. And the motive that is associated with him is this. It's just that, all it is. It could be Wagnerian. And that, notice it is 4 notes down and a leap up. And that's all it is. It's thundered out by the timpani, and you can't miss it within the first 5 minutes of the opera. Now, the next character we meet is a horrible old man who dresses himself up as youth and lots of rouge. He's called a fop, an elderly fop. And his motive is, of course, the same, but it's different because the spacing, the leap this time is much bigger. So it's 4 notes down and up to the top, and that is characterized by having him sing the top notes falsetto. So you get mi, mi, tra, woo, like that. Special falsetto effect. And the interval gets very wide when he bids farewell to the fop. This is on the boat going over to Venice for the first time. And the last thing he does is au revoir Conte. Au revoir Conte. It's right up there. It's an enormous leap. And there it is. That's the second character. Now the third character is an obstinate gondolier who rows him from the boat station to Lido. He really wanted, Aschenbach wanted to go by Vaporetto, but the gondolier absolutely insists on taking him the whole way. And eventually he decides to let him do it. Now his motive is the same pattern, but it's chuntering. Passengers must follow where I lead. No force for the living, no cause for the dead. And that goes on, a little conversation goes through. Eventually, Aschenbach decides to leave him alone. So again, you've still got the 4 notes down, a rather small interval. So the next one, number 4, is going to be the rather suave hotel manager. Now he presents his music on top of large brass chords. We are delighted to greet the Signore to our excellent hotel. We trust the Signore has a pleasant journey. He will have a pleasant sojourn, I am sure. Etc. That comes quite several times. It keeps coming back. The hotel manager is a very important part, one of the longer ones of the subsidiary roles. Then we do a little cut to the second act, because number 5 is a motive which goes with the hotel barber. Ashbach has his hair cut on stage, and his motive is this. So what's happened to our 4 notes down and 1 leap? It's going the other way around. So instead of 4 notes down, it's 4 notes up. And the leap is down. It's what we call inversion. His motive is inversion. Your head down, if you please. So the barber does his job. And there it is. Number 6 is, in fact, the last 2, player number 6 is the leader of the players. There's a strolling players come and perform outside the Lido, and all the guests come and watch. That has no motives of these anymore. There's something else in there, which I'll tell you about in a second. And the last one, Dionysus, is an offstage part, usually sung offstage, and has no motivic relation at all. But we've got 5 permutations of this 4 notes and a leap. That's the basic rule of the baritone role. Now, there are other things that are rather important, as it were, what Wagner might have called Wotan's breath or something, a motive that is abstract in a sense. And the most important, no, not the most important, there are 3 important ones. One is the plague. Just 4 notes. And sometimes it comes like that, sometimes it comes out. And sometimes it comes just like that, all 4 notes at once, which is rather dissonant, but plague isn't pleasant anyway. So one can understand that. Then there is the Serenissima motive. Now this comes whenever somebody has to journey from the Lido to Venice or from Venice to the Lido. It's the same music, but it changes. It has the same pattern. And here it goes. So you keep the lapping sound of water underneath, and meanwhile you've got the song in top. Serenissima, serenissima, row us over to serenissima. Very beautiful tune. That's the overture. And that takes us through into the first scene. The overture comes after the second scene, that is, after they've travelled to Venice. There's a big interlude, and then we get going on the story from Venice onwards. Now, one final motive, or rather 2 things I have to explain, is a very important motive, the view. Now, this comes out of what the hotel manager is saying. He says... where's he gone? There he is. And here is it's just showing him his Aschenbach, the room that he's reserved. And here is the room as you commanded, And look, signore, the view. That's a great moment there, riding that chord. I'll go on in a second. Do it once again. And it is the room as you commanded. And look, signore, the view. The view of the beach from our rooms is superb, from this one especially. Thank you. It will do very well. So that motive comes a lot, and it's very concordant, harmonic. The harmony goes all the same underneath. And when it wants to sound less fruity than that, he simply puts it into the minor key. And so it turns up in the next scene like this. And can sit always down below. The same pattern of chords. So that's the view. Now, the last thing I have to point on this particular exercise is the mother, Tadzio, and his mother. In fact, the Polish family. The Polish family consists of the guests in the hotel, of a governess, 2 small girls, Tadzio, and his friend from school, who's obviously coming with them to enjoy the holiday, as a school friend does, called Yashu. And then there is his mother. There is no father to be seen on the picture. That belongs to another family. But that's the party, and they're all dancers. They communicate through mime. They do not sing a single note. And we don't actually observe the family till the opera's been going for about 40 minutes. And then suddenly there's something really rather startling happens. Shall we, Andrew, just do this? The music exclusively concerned with the Polish family is done on the tuned percussion. So it's a very striking effect when we first hear the vibraphone with Tadzio's motive. And I'm going to play on a little bit as we go through, because his mother has a motive as well, which is joined to Tadzio. So here we go. Just dinner guests going into the hotel, dinner, dining room. Two features of that music which are characteristic of the Balinese gamelan, which Britain was passionately interested in. He visited the Far East more than once and loved listening to the Balinese players. they work on percussive instruments, and there's two things could be noted. First of all, there's a drone. So we had this, sorry, up here. The bottom part stayed the same all the way through. There's a sort of drone, like a bagpipe, but rather nicer. And then we got another example of this figure that comes taking hold of the key and shaking it, starting fast. That's very characteristic of the gamelan. One of its effects. It could be the other way around. If you can do it, you can do slow and getting faster. I did one of those there. So there we go. That concludes the motive bit. Would you like to? Are you going to come in now and do something?
What was your next step?
Well, my next step was to do one or two examples of colouring, and we're going to do a little bit of a scene from Andrew.
I think, would you carry on?
Yeah, I can carry on. People, I don't want people to get bored.
Could I interrupt?
Yes, please do.
Is Alan here? Hi. Did we get sound? We didn't. Okay, so my examples are null and void. So take as long as you like.
I think it would probably be nice actually to do the very opening and tell you why. Because the opera starts in a very sort of muted and subdued way. Aschenbach is wandering around the streets of Munich, and he's got writer's block. He cannot get his thoughts in order, and so it's all going around in his head. The description, done very quietly, of how his mind beats on, is absolutely masterfully written. It's very, very quiet. And I should just say that when we did this piece in America, the Americans don't go for quiet effects very heavily. They like things loud and big with lots of trumpets. So they were a little bit bemused by this piece. But however, it has its rewards, because if you, Britain believed, if you will find almost all his operas, almost all, not quite all, but almost all, and most of his works end quietly. They never end with a bang. That is inviting applause. They tend to end quietly. And he believed in the power of softness. That is, if you wanted to make an effect, you did it softer, not louder. And this comes all the way through this opera, that sort of thing. And one always has to be careful that you don't make it sort of over big. And the result of that is that the orchestra doesn't play too loud, and you should be able to hear every word. Now, I can quite understand somebody coming to this opera for the first time and not being able to hear every word, but that is because you're listening to a strange and new sort of concept. I can assure you that if, assuming you come to the performance and think, oh, well, I'm not sure that I didn't know about that, which is quite possible, and I would understand that. But if you were to take the libretto home with you, read it through, and come to another performance, you would be amazed at the difference. Just the reading of the libretto enables you to hear words which you didn't think you could. And it becomes a completely different thing. And I cannot advise that too strongly as a sort of exercise, if you can possibly bear to do it. And if you can trust me on that. It really is true. Reading the libretto is unbelievably helpful. It really works. So, this is the very start of the opera. It all starts very, very quietly with mysterious effects. And Aschenbach climbs out of it, as it were, just for a short time, which you could call Aschenbach's pride, when the trumpets play. I, Aschenbach. But still, we'll hear it, if I can find it. Here we go. see the difference between the Aschenbach pride and his lost in terrible thoughts. I think that's fairly clear, isn't it? The idea.
Can I interject?
Please, yes. Oh, yes, I'm supposed to have said that.
Slightly long digression, but since we don't have my sound, this is a very good point to talk about it. We're going to use scary words. Dodecaphony, serialism. I've always said when I've taught students opera appreciation classes, there is nothing you cannot grasp so long as it is an expression of the state of the drama. Now, what is amazing about this opening is that Aschenbach actually sings, again, scary terms, 12 notes of the chromatic scale. He actually slightly repeats 2 of them in climbing up the line. But what in effect he's singing is a Schoenbergian tone row. The definition of this, before you get too worried about it, is very beautifully outlined in Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus. The hero Adrian Leverkühn, at one point, although not exclusively as I used to think, actually takes up this theory as a kind of attempt to systematize music once late Romanticism has sort of gone like this. He feels that there's a need to bring order back into the whole setup. And Mann actually took Leverkühn's description from Schoenberg's theory of harmony. So this should be intelligible to the general reader. Music grows wild, he said. Its various elements, melody, harmony, counterpoint, form and instrumentation, have developed over time independently of one another without any plan. Whenever one isolated realm of material was advanced by history and given higher rank, others remained behind, defying within the unity of the work the developmental stage now asserted by whatever had moved ahead. Take, for instance, the role that counterpoint plays in Romanticism. There it is a mere adjunct to homophonic composition, in other words, a single line. Either it is an external combination of homophonically conceived themes, different single lines all acting together, or simply a harmonic chorale clad in an ornamental array of pseudo-voices. I can already hear this is getting a little bit arcane, but now we're getting to the point. True counterpoint demands the simultaneity of independent voices. Counterpoint designed as melodic harmony, such as that in late Romanticism, works is none at all. He says, I want to make all this rational. Now, I think I've probably got the wrong definition there. So this is it. Let me make absolutely sure I've got the right passage. The tonal space is generally too limited. One would have to proceed and build longer words from the 12 steps of the tempered semitone alphabet. So if you go up the scale, Steuart, you just play the 12 notes. And then back to the first note. I mean, the standard scale of 7 notes is on the white keys. The 12 tones are on the white and the black. Now, what Leverkühn proposes is that if you build longer words from the 12 steps of the tempered semitone alphabet, words of 12 letters, specific combinations and interrelations of the 12 semitones, rows of notes from which then the piece, a given movement, or a whole work of several movements will be strictly derived. Each tone in the entire composition, melodic and harmonic, would have to demonstrate its relation to this predetermined basic row. None would dare recur until all have first occurred. No note would dare appear that did not fulfill its motif function within the structure as a whole. Free notes would no longer exist. This is what I would call a strict style. Now, we know what happened when Schoenberg applied the strict style. Thank God history has proved him wrong, and dodecaphony has become a dead end. Now, both Britten and his great contemporary, Shostakovich, perceived what was wrong with all this. Let me start with Britten in 1964. Serialism, that's to say, I'm coming to Shostakovich, Schoenberg's idea of making sure that you had a row of all 12 notes, none of which could be repeated in the serial theme, had simply never attracted me as a method, although I respect many composers who have worked with it and love some of their works. I think what he loved particularly was the music of Alban Berg, who uses this system in later works very, very selectively. It is beyond me to say why, except that I cannot feel that tonality is outworn. I'm trying to read my own writing here. And I find many serial rules arbitrary. Socially, I am seriously disturbed by its limitations. I can see it taking no part in the music lover's music making. Its methods make writing gratefully for voices or instruments an impossibility which inhibits amateurs and young children. Now, what in fact happens in later Britten works is that he actually does use tone rows. You've just heard Andrew sing, one going up, my mind beats on, and no words come, all 12 notes, and then taxing, tiring, unyielding, unproductive, all 12 notes but coming down. And in between, the orchestra plays all 12 notes simultaneously in the most extraordinary orchestration, isn't it, Steuart? I think it's just spine-tinglingly amazing. Now, why should Britten do this? He wants to express Aschenbach's frozen state of mind. I mean, I'm also fascinated by the opening rhythm. It's said that Britten had a sort of heart arrhythmia, which first alerted him to the possibility of something wrong. And it could either be this mind beating on, but the irregularity of it. As in Mahler's Ninth Symphony, at the very beginning, you have an irregular heartbeat. Da, 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 which apparently was Mahler's representation of his own problem. So you've got that going on as well, but moreover, you've got Aschenbach frozen, trying by force of will, which is when you get the trumpet and the fortissimo and the key of E major, which is very rooted. I'm trying to pull myself together, but he can't find a solution. So he's stuck, and the whole opera is really about his journey of seeking beauty and finding something else, perhaps. So I would argue that in Britain, and this is where I was going to give you parallel examples, also in the late works of Shostakovich, you find the tone row used for a certain sterility or a certain anguish or a sense of, I can't get out of this. But in fact, when you do get out of it, as in the beautiful music of the view from the balcony, which is tonal and emancipating, you feel, this immense relief. It's like a demonstration of tonality. And in fact, the whole opera ends, I don't want to preempt you here, Steuart, but it ends in the most magically suspended A major. A major for Britten was the love key. It was the music he wrote for hymns to his teenage lover Wolf Scherchen in the 1930s. And so that's the key of emancipation, of love, of resolution. And of course there is a resolution in the opera. But I just want to also finally, before I hand back to you, quote Shostakovich on this, because the two men were great friends. Shostakovich dedicated his 14th symphony to Britten, who gave the first UK performance at the Maltings in 1970. And Britten in Death in Venice actually quotes a heartbreaking song setting Apollinaire's poem The Suicide, Threlili, Threlili, which becomes the song of the strawberry seller in Death in Venice. Le belle fragole, da, 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 which is repeated in a very sad and melancholy way in the last act. So if I had been able to parallel it, I would have showed you that both Shostakovich's last symphony, the 15th, and Death in Venice have these 12-note rows for anguish and despair, and both end in A major with resonating percussion. Very, very extraordinary resolutions. And Britten was following what Shostakovich had done, but being a great genius, he absorbed and made all that his own. So let me just finally read you what Shostakovich has to say about this. As far as the use of strictly technical devices from such musical systems as dodecaphony, the 12-tone system, serialism, is concerned, everything in good measure. If, let's say, a composer sets himself the obligatory task of writing dodecaphonic music, then he artificially limits the possibilities of his ideas. The use of elements from these complex systems is fully justified if it is dictated by the content of the composition. I think the formula, the end justifies the means, is valid in music. All means, all of them. if they contribute to the end objective. And I think that's what we get here. So let me hand you back and ask if you agree or disagree.
Well, I was actually going to say, I don't think that Britain is quite as serious about dodecaphonia as you reckon.
Right.
He regarded it as a sort of an exercise in, well, just nodding in that direction. The opening of Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, is exact an example of how he works. He's got three-part chords going bom, bim, bom, bim, bom, bom, and by the time he's got to bar 6 or whatever it is, he's gone through the whole of the chromatic scale. And there's loads of that in Midsummer Night's Dream. There's one particularly telling incident where he'd written a duet, which the two lovers sing, I swear to thee, and they sing it, get through 12 keys in the course of it. Diddly, 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 I swear to thee, I swear to thee, diddly, 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 I swear to thee. Now, when he'd finished done his sketches, he discovered, to his horror, that he'd left one key out. So he sort of rewrote the bar and had to put it in. You know, that would not have been, he wouldn't have liked to be caught out in something like that. So I'm not sure that I can go wholehearted with you on this seriously.
Yeah, what I really wanted to add was that the fact that you can sing, that I can pick up Aschenbach's opening lines, and they are all 12 notes, means that Britain has written a tone row that is singable. And the only other composer I know who does that is Berg, in Lulu especially, because a lot of it's consonants, so you can memorise it. But I can't memorise a note of later Schoenberg.
It is hard. So, look, we're going to give you the beach, a little bit of the beach scene. There's a reason for this. It shows you what happens to the view motive. That one. How it develops. And then we come to the ballet music. Because the Polish family don't speak, they have to dance. And so they have a fair number of dance music, all for this Balinese sort of ensemble. And indeed, you'll hear the strawberry teller coming in just at the end of this example. This takes a little bit of time. So, first of all, the view. hear the drone going over the Strawberry Sellers music, and of course all that. All the same bottom rhythm. Consistent. So that I don't think I'm going to deal with heterophony for the moment. I think, how's our time?
Coming up to question time, but we'd like to hear a bit more from Andrew.
I can give you the Phaedrus. I think we ought to do the Phaedrus aria. that will do it, right? Oh, yes. This is the aria that the nearest thing we have to an aria for Aschenbach, right at the end when all is almost over. He turns to the Socratic dialogues, which I hope you'll be able to understand. Unfortunately, this particular section has been completely ruined for me because Peter Pears could never get the argument right. It was always, in fact, his... Actually, don't misunderstand me. His performance was unbelievable. It really was. But it did have these strange drawbacks. He would be the first to admit it. I mean, he used to say, "Oh God, what have I done now?" But there's one wonderful moment in a bit we've just done. Surely the soul of Greece lies in that bright perfection, which is a lovely line. Have you seen this beautiful boy? Surely the soul of Greece. But when he turned out one night and did, surely the smell of Greece. It put a completely different complexion on the whole thing. The dirty kitchens and all that. In this particular number at the moment, it's just as well you got the score there because it's so easy to go wrong. And I never understood what he was saying. But here we go.